So today we're going to talk about the origin of the U.S. government. So we're going to kind of do a timeline first. So if you will, on your paper you should have a line, and it's kind of we're going to be doing it on the longer side of the paper. So when we talk about like how did we get to this point of government in our life, that we've got three branches, and we've got a government in which we've got a president as well as a Congress and judges. How did we get that? Well, we really have to go back and we have to look at the beginning before we can talk about our current government. We got to step back for just a second. So on our far left part of our paper, we're going to talk about how there was an absolute monarchy in England for centuries. So for hundreds of years, we had some famous leaders. We had Henry VIII. We had several Queen Marys, Queen Elizabeth, of course. And so when we're looking at why do we have the sort of government we have today, we must go back and see that we had kings and queens who had complete and total control. It is important to understand that where did these people get their power from? Why were these people who wore these very ostentatious outfits, where did they get the power from? And it really comes from these people were appointed, their royalty, and so they were appointed by God. So whenever anybody would dare to question the king or queen, well, wait, they wouldn't question the king or queen, because if you question the king or queen, then that means you're questioning God. So for an extended amount of time, the king or queens are in power, and eventually in 1215 we have some people that end up writing a document called the Magna Carta. Now the Magna Carta is the first major attempt to try to limit the king's power. Now this is a big deal. This is the first time someone said, hey, king, you are abusive, you need to sit down and stop. And well, it was an attempt, and that should tell you a lot right there. Because it was an attempt, that means it was not successful. However, this is two major things resulted. This is the first time someone said, hey, you're acting ridiculous. And so when you say that, that means you're saying that even though God appointed you, we still think you're acting ridiculous, and that's huge. But then it also expands the king's advisory group. So their advisory group prior to the Magna Carta was a bunch of people who would maybe offer suggestions, but really weren't taken seriously. When this advisory group ends up being called Parliament. Now, England still has a parliament to this day. The parliament's a little bit different, though. We'll explain that. This parliament ends up becoming the legislative branch. This is the group that makes laws. And so in England today, they have a legislator called Parliament, and they make laws that govern England today. And it's not the king or queen anymore, but that's kind of a different story. Eventually, though, this is what ends up happening. So the Magna Carta is a big deal for two reasons. It was a first attempt, and it establishes Parliament. Now, let's do a little side note over here. There's two types of legislators. Now, England has a bicameral legislator, and a bicameral legislator means that it is two houses. Bi means two, like if you have a bicycle, you have two wheels. A unicycle would have one wheel, just like a unicameral legislator has one house. So if we keep on going throughout time, so the king is starting to act a little bit more ridiculous, and they end up transitioning over to a constitutional monarchy. Now, if you remember from our last video, a constitutional monarchy is a monarchy that is limited by a constitution. And that ends up kind of happening in 1689 with this document called the English Bill of Rights. King William and Queen Mary long story very short here, end up signing over their rights with the English Bill of Rights. Notice it's got the word English in front of it, so it's not the American Bill of Rights, but we're talking about the English Bill of Rights. Now, these English Bill of Rights were signed by or written by Parliament, and they were signed by King William and Queen Mary, which if you've ever been to Virginia, there's a university called William and Mary. But anyway, this is the very first time ever that a king or queen willingly said, okay, I'm not going to be the main guy in charge anymore. This is huge. This had never happened before, because once someone had that much power, once you were in control of a country who was like England, which had so much power, they gave up their power and nobody died. Because nobody died, this is called the Glorious Revolution. And the reason why it's glorious is because nobody died. A revolution, it means a change. And this is amazing. This has never happened before. So they lost, the absolute monarchy went away, and they now have a constitutional monarchy. About this time, let's pause for just a second. The English Bill of Rights, once they get written, this is also huge, because they end up coming in, they start saying things like no cruel and unusual punishment, because back then, if you spoke a little sarcastic or something to one of the king's men, you would lose your tongue. If you sassed your parents, you would be taken out and you would be whipped in the town square. If you stole something, you would lose a hand. So for the first time ever, they're going to really limit the king's and queen's power and the government's power by saying no cruel and unusual punishment. They also say that you have to have a trial by jury, versus before, you could just have a quick trial that, with just one person saying, a local judge that was appointed by the king and had to do the king's bidding. And the trial would be very quick, and hardly no evidence would be used, to put it mildly. But now they're saying that you have to have a trial by jury. These two rights right here are ones that we later copied in America. 2 of them. There's some more. So during this time, so if we're a little bit before the monarchy, the constitutional monarchy was established, and a little bit after, so if you look at kind of where on our timeline, we end up having our 13 colonies get established. So our very first one is going to be in Jamestown, Virginia in 1607. If you've heard of the movie Pocahontas, it is kind of supposed to be based around this time period, so in Jamestown, Virginia, you end up having your very first representative democracy. In 1620, you end up having the Pilgrims come, and the Pilgrims were aiming for Virginia, but they got a little lost, and they ended up in Massachusetts. So when I say a little lost, I really mean a lot. The difference between these two is that Virginia and Jamestown, Virginia, they only brought men, so they quickly kind of adapted and had to relate to the local Indian tribes. And in Massachusetts, they arrived and it was wintertime, and so they ended up having a rather difficult time, and the Native Americans came in and also helped them out. The very last colony to be established, so our very first one is Virginia, then Massachusetts, and then along the way, we've got the other colonies, and their very last one was Georgia in 1732. Now, during this time period, all of this right here, we have this period called Salutary Neglect. Now, let's talk about Salutary Neglect for just a second. This is when the king is going to ignore the colonists. And what that means is it is going to make it so that, just like any child, if a parent ignores a child for any length of time, eventually the child is going to figure out what they need to do in order to take care of themselves. So like say, for example, say a 5-year-old is being neglected and doesn't have proper supervision. Well, the child, if there's food in the house and the parent's just not looking after them, eventually the child is probably going to go and find some food, and they'll figure out, how to operate the microwave, or pour themselves a bowl of cereal. And while that's not necessarily bad for a 5-year-old to be able to figure out how to feed themselves, it does mean that, say, for example, when the child's 15, for example, and the parent tries to come back in and tell the child what to do, they get a little resentful, and suddenly the 15-year-old saying, I've been taking care of myself for quite a long time, and who are you to come in? So the king is ignoring the colonists, he's ignoring the children, his children, and the children start taking care of themselves, and they start running their own governments and their own economies, figuring out how to do stuff. Now this ends up being very relevant because eventually something happens. The French and Indian War, which lasted not quite 10 years if you look at those dates, and it's actually called a war. Most people in other countries don't call it the French and Indian War, because in America it was the French and Indians versus the British. England usually calls it the 9 Years' War. But with the French and Indian War, the French and Indians ended up banding together to fight the British in the hopes that they could get the British kicked out, and then the Native Americans are planning on moving on to the French. That's another story. So with the French and Indian War, the British end up winning this war, and that's wonderful for the colonists. They are super excited. However, Great Britain, who fought a war for 9 years on foreign soil, ends up being very, very broke. And so because they didn't have enough money, they end up starting to tax the colonists through this period right here. And eventually the colonists get very tired of that, and they end up declaring their independence and saying, we don't want to be with you, Great Britain, anymore, because you're trying to take all of our money and you're being abusive. And anyway, we're going to talk about that more in detail. So that's kind of the big picture right there, of how did we get to this point.